welcome back. Let's talk about music in the 2000s. So, New Year's Eve, 1999, as it's about to turn into the year 2000, there's this widespread fear of something called Y2K. Y2K just stood for Y is for year, 2 is for 2, and K is for 1,000, an abbreviation kind of like kilogram or kilometer. So Y2K, year 2000. The problem was that a lot of computers, especially computers that were built in earlier years, for whatever reason, the people who designed them hadn't built in the forethought for transferring over to the year 2000. And there was fear that the calendars within these computers would be fixed on a 100-year span, and we would get to 1999, 11:59 p.m. It would transfer over to midnight, but it would default back to the year 1900 or some earlier year, maybe the year the computer was built, let's say 1983 or something. And these big computers that were being used in banks, that were old but had a ton of information, valuable, sensitive information, that if they went back in time, they could lose everything. So that was the fear, that the computers would lead to widespread chaos, information either disappearing or being made public, something like that. And people were freaking out. They were buying toilet paper. As you know now, that's a theme. Any kind of panic happens, people buy all the toilet paper. It was just widespread fear as to what could happen. Well, Y2K hits, midnight hits, nothing happens, all the computers change over. Turns out computers can do basic math. As we're watching the New Year's Eve celebration at Times Square in New York, No Doubt is performing, but rather than performing one of their own songs, they perform It's the End of the World as We Know It, right at midnight by REM, which is very fitting for the apocalyptic nature. So they had sort of a playful approach to it. Well, the year turns to 2000, and in the specific year 2000, it was the biggest year of record sales in history. The fervor of Beatlemania was going on, but not for just one group like it was from the Beatles, but for many groups, because teen pop mania is still at its height, just as it was when we left the 90s, but it's gaining momentum. Everybody needed every record, so everyone who was a fan of this teen pop, it wasn't enough to just go buy the one Beatles album the day it comes out. You have to buy the Backstreet Boys album, the NSYNC album, the Christina Aguilera, the Britney Spears, the Jessica Simpson. You need all of these albums right away, and that's what contributes to these absolutely astounding record sales. The Backstreet Boys come out with their song I Want It That Way, and NSYNC hits like Bye 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 and It's Gonna Be Me, which has subsequently been turned into the meme It's Gonna Be May. Britney Spears with Oops, I Did It Again, selling 1.3 million copies in the first week alone. At this point, Britney Spears is dating Justin Timberlake of NSYNC, sort of the lead singer of NSYNC. And again, they've known each other since the early 90s because they were on the Mickey Mouse Club together. However, surprising everyone, in the kind of getting away from the early 2000s, approaching the mid 2000s, Justin Timberlake goes solo. And he creates this sound that appeals to both pop and R&B audiences, with early hits such as Rock Your Body and Cry Me a River, eventually going on later in the decade to release songs like Sexy Back. He has enormous success in movies with some films In Time, Friends with Benefits, The Social Network, and Trolls. He's also successful on television, hosting Saturday Night Live multiple times. Beyoncé of Destiny's Child has continued success. Destiny's Child releases the hit single Survivor in 2002. Shortly after that, Beyoncé follows Justin Timberlake's model and goes solo. Her first big single she releases is called Crazy in Love with Jay-Z, who's a popular rapper at the time. Again, this was in 2003. However, even though at this point, the first few years, the record industry is at an all-time high, it's about to hit an all-time low. In order to talk about this, we have to talk about a music program called Napster. So in this new generation, a lot of people don't think that music is something that you should have to pay for. They don't think it's wrong to be able to get music for free if you download it onto your PC. So they're using Napster, which is this website, or LimeWire, which is another website to download music for free. Now, what's interesting is this is very similar to the argument that we heard about radio at the beginning of the century, at the beginning of the 1900s rather than the 2000s. As radio catches on, a lot of publishers and songwriters are saying that radio is illegal because you're disseminating this music for free. People should have to go buy the sheet music. They shouldn't just be able to hear the song. It's the exact same argument, but it's being made about the internet now. So, in the late 90s, people tracking technological innovations began warning those in the record industry that they needed to invest in new technologies because computers and the internet were going to change the world and change the music industry. However, no one listened, everyone ignored their warnings. Then, sure enough, this website called Napster.com, co founded by Sean Fanning and Sean Parker, allows for what they call file sharing. So they're saying they're sharing files, but really you're getting it for free from someone else just giving it to you. These are MP3s. So MP3 stands for MPEG 1 Audio Layer 3, and MPEG is just an abbreviation itself for Moving Pictures Experts Group. So just a regular MP3, it's a song file. Metallica, and this is when it really starts to catch up, gain steam, this anger over Napster that we're going to see. So Metallica hears an unreleased song called I Disappear on the radio. Again, they've just written the song, they're about to release it on their new record, and they hear it on the radio, and they learn that it was leaked from Napster, and they are enraged, and they sue Napster for encouraging people to steal and trade music illegally. Other musicians like Dr. Dre are also angry and also join the cause, but Metallica is really leading this charge. The fans are angry about their response, and they even start this website called xmetallicafans.com, and Metallica holds these news conferences, and counter-protesters show up saying that music, it's one thing to go buy music in the stores, but it should be allowed for people to share their music online. Now, not every band that was upset by this. We have groups like the band Dashboard Confessional. They have the song Screaming Infidelities, and they were picked out of obscurity and given a career without a major record label, and it's because their music was heard and was able to grow organically through Napster. Through people sharing their song, it became popular without the music industry. This is critically important. This is going to be really the theme of the next 20 years of music. The fact that artists are finding a way to achieve large-scale success without going through the machine that is the record industry. So just like bands in the early days of MTV who happened to have a video and they were given this online platform, other bands are now being given a platform. Now, the opposition is saying that music is copied and given to millions of people that you don't know. And again, this echoes of the early days of radio. However, Sean Fanning, one of the founders of Napster, says there's a way to do this legally in which everyone is happy. He wants to find a middle ground. He's not trying to steal or take advantage of these performers or these publishers and music companies, but they still think that there is value in this concept of people getting their music through the internet. Well, it doesn't work out. On July 11, 2001, Napster is shut down in order to pay $26 million in back royalties. Napster couldn't pay, and they filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in 2002. Now, if you research Napster today, there is a company called Napster, and it is still a music-based website, but it is not the Napster from the early 2000s. That company closed. Another company kind of rose from the ashes with the same name, but it is separate. The original Napster shut down in 2002. Well, shortly before that, let's back up about a year and talk about another approach to people getting their music from online. So for this, we have to talk about iTunes. It was developed by Apple and their founder, one of their founders, Steve Jobs. So by 2001, MP3 players in which one could store and play music on its own began selling. It's like before this, we would have had a CD player or a Sony Walkman, which is that plays cassettes, and you can take it with you. It's battery powered, but now we have the MP3 player. It's so much smaller. It's just this tiny little thing, and you can put music on there and go anywhere. Well, in 2001, Apple co-founder Steve Jobs notices the rise of digital file sharing, and he reflects on a few facts. Young people are sharing music. MP3 players allow those young people to take their music anywhere. MP3 players had a limited capacity. Most of them could play between 32 and 64 minutes of music. You pay more for the larger storage, of course, and that is approximately 9 to 18 songs. So the biggest MP3 players can only hold 18 songs. Apple had an uncanny ability to make technology accessible for the rest of us, for normal people, making these technological advances accessible. And a really cool MP3 player that worked with the Mac and for the Mac would further extend the iMac, their computer at the time. Apple employees, they wanted a cool MP3 player, so that they could build their own music libraries for themselves. And much of the technology needed to build this better MP3 player already existed. They didn't need to invent anything. They just had to build it from parts they already had based on a model they already had. So for example, we have these small hard drives from Toshiba, miniature batteries from Sony, FireWire interface from Texas Instruments, and the MP3 hardware blueprint from Portal Player. Well, Apple developed the iPod and iTunes, and at this point, iTunes was just a library. So it's a program that you install on your iMac, your Apple computer only, and it's only a library, meaning you have songs, you have the CDs, you put them into iTunes, and then iTunes can load them onto your iPod, which iPod is their MP3 player. All of this is done not because of Steve Jobs' love of music, but because it's a way to drive iMac sales. Imagine how many more iMacs we could sell if we had this cool MP3 player that you could buy as an additional charge. Many people at Apple did not think the iPod would be a big deal, and in 2002 it accounted for less than 3% of their sales. However, people loved the iPod. Customers loved iTunes for the Mac, and iPod sales more than doubled in 1 year. The music industry challenges that were growing with people getting music online coincided with iTunes' success growing and Apple's success growing. So the music industry falls as Apple is climbing. Apple employees specifically wanted an easy way to download music without stealing. Again, at this point with iTunes, you have to actually have the CD, put it on your computer, transfer the songs onto iTunes, and then have it. But they want to just download their songs directly, but they didn't want to steal. They wanted a legal way to purchase their music in a way where it was fairly priced and really convenient. So what happens is Apple strikes a deal with many of the major record labels to sell individual songs for 99 cents each through the iTunes store. Many music industry executives were initially terrified of iTunes singles because the song purchase model at the time was called bundling, and they didn't want to unbundle a hit song. So what this means, I'll give you an example from the early 2000s. Avril Lavigne releases this song, Complicated. Now, that song sold 20 million copies. In the late 90s, a hit song like Complicated that sells 20 million copies, people want the song, that would mean they would need to go buy the album. It's $10. So 20 million copies of a $10 album is $200 million in profit from one hit song. With the iTunes model, it would be 20 million songs at 99 cents each, not $10 each, which gives you only 19.8 million. So we're going from 200 million to less than 20 million, a loss of over 90%. A loss, think about that, a loss of over 90%. We're talking about huge numbers. They could have made 200 million on one song, and they're losing more than 90% because of file sharing. Now with file sharing, they're actually losing 100%, right? But at least with the iTunes model, they're able to just buy the song they want. Well, CD sales had already dropped. Just in those 3 years, they dropped by 25%, and those numbers were continuing to climb. So really, the music industry executives didn't have a choice. It was adopt this iTunes model where people are paying for just the songs they want, or accept that they're going to keep doing the file sharing anyway and you don't get anything. So really, they're kind of forced into this deal. So they agreed. Now this proves a few things. It proved that millions of people would rather buy music than steal it if it's easy to access and fairly priced. It also proved the success, though, of iTunes. So at this point, iTunes was only available for Mac, but more than 1 billion people in the world owned a Windows computer. So that was a billion potential customers for iTunes and for the iPod that they weren't able to access because it only worked for Apple products. Well, finally, iTunes and iPod, because of the success on Apple products, were made available for Windows, multiplying the potential market by more than 20 times. We then get to see a bunch of other iPods emerge, like the iPod mini, the 30 gig, the 60 gig, the 80 gig, the iPod Shuffle, iPod Nano. Eventually can hold movies and TV shows. By 2005, so just 3 years later, by 2005, Apple was selling more iPods than they were selling iMacs, so more MP3 players than computers. And then finally, 2 years later, by 2007, a telephone function is added to the iPod where not only can you do all this with music and movies and television, but you can even call people from your iPod, and it's at that point that it's rebranded as the iPhone. So what I would like to know is, of the people watching this, how many of you have an iPhone right now? I'd say it's at least half, probably half, right? A lot of people still have Android, but I think more than half the market is an iPhone. So if we think back to this model, this all comes from file sharing knocked over domino after domino after domino, and finally to this point where all of us have a portable MP3 player in our pockets. It's also a computer. They can go on the internet and they can make calls. Well, this model that I've explained to you, all this information, much of the research comes from author Jim Collins and Morton T. Hansen with their incredible book, Great by Choice. So if you're interested more about this, check out the book, Great by Choice, 2011. Excellent read. That's where all this information about iTunes comes from, the specific details. So let's move on. So that's the first major shift, right? The music industry all but crumbles in just a few years. By 2005, everything is different. 2000, things were going great. From 2001, 2005, everything falls apart. But that's not the only change. We also see the rise of MySpace and social media. So how are people discovering music by groups such as Dashboard Confessional, this song, Screaming Infidelities? Because you could search for it on Napster or LimeWire, but how would you know what to look for, right? So the way they're finding this music is through social media, and social media really starts to emerge at this point. About 2003 is when I think when MySpace comes onto the scene. So bands can showcase their music on their MySpace, on their social media page. And for those of you not familiar with MySpace, it's a precursor to Facebook. It's very similar to Facebook, but there are a few changes. If you have a Facebook profile right now, someone goes to your profile and it's just basic information about you, right? It's pretty bland. However, with MySpace, you can customize your background, you can change the layout, you can change the font, you can have things falling. It's all in HTML. I learned HTML through MySpace. You have what's called your top 8, where you choose your 8 favorite friends, or you can change that to just the top 4, top 16, top 32. You can even not have anyone. Everyone starts with Tom Anderson, who was the founder of the company. You add your friends. I think one of the main differences is they had these things called bulletins, which was kind of just like a normal feed where you would post, but for some reason they seemed different. People could, like, you would post quizzes and surveys where you talk about yourself. You also had a music portion on your MySpace page where you would upload your favorite songs. If you're just a regular page, or you can make a band page where you upload your songs. You would get picture comments. Again, it's very similar to Facebook, but music and customization were really, really important to MySpace. So through MySpace and through MySpace pages for bands, we're sharing the ideas of these bands. Hey, check out this band, check out their MySpace page. You just email someone the URL for their MySpace page or what they're called, and they check it out, they get to hear the music. Then they go on Napster and they download the songs for free. So that's how it's spreading at this point. And again, Facebook emerged as the winner by the late 2000s, but in the early and mid 2000s, it really seemed like MySpace was going to be the one that would emerge as the winner. So for most of the decade, it's all about MySpace. And Panic at the Disco is another group that emerged from MySpace with songs like 9 in the Afternoon, also a band called 303, which is a duo with their songs Don't Trust Me. These bands, like Dashboard Confessional, are famous through MySpace and file sharing. We also see one more change to the music industry that's very important. It's called the rise of satellite radio. So initially, in the very early 2000s, there were 2 satellite radio stations. One was called XM Satellite Radio, launched in 2001. The other was called Sirius Satellite Radio, launched in 2002. Well, by 2008, the two of them have merged into Sirius XM. So let's talk about what satellite radio is. So again, we think about the growth of radio. Initially, we had small stations which can spread their radio signal a certain radius around, depending on how large the station is, how large the radio tower is. The largest ones were called superstations, and they could send the signal as far as 600 miles. But we also get to the point where they're connected by cables, so that a station in Chicago can send their signal to a station in Los Angeles, and they both have a superstation. They can both spread by 600 miles, get enough of these superstations, you're getting to the point where you can kind of connect the whole country. But it's still very regional because while superstations were in the big cities, many small towns still relied on local radio stations. However, the way satellite radio works is, as you would imagine, there are satellites in the Earth's orbit which send the signals straight down to the country. So it's much easier to blanket the country evenly. This introduces a few other changes, though. At this point, there's no longer such a thing as regional radio. Of course, there are still local XM and FM radio stations, but satellite radio is a way where people get to hear the same music in San Diego and Los Angeles and Washington and Maine and Florida. This is not subscription based, so you don't have to rely on advertisers. So you pay a monthly fee and then you get it. It's a very reasonable fee. It's a couple dollars a month. Like the classic rock changes that we started to see in the 1990s, where classic rock starts to come on the radio, we get to this point where satellite radio, Sirius XM, has a channel for anything you can possibly imagine. A channel for college football, a channel for college hockey, a channel for conservative politics, for liberal politics, for neutral politics. Music of the 40s, music of the 50s, music of the 60s, music of the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, music for funk, music for hair metal, music for heavy metal, channels for Christian talk radio, channels for Christian music. We just see absolutely anything you can imagine pop up. And in fact, the most successful SiriusXM channel is Howard Stern's channel. He has two channels. One plays new content, the other one plays reruns, and Howard Stern gets paid $100 million a year in 5-year contracts. So he's been doing this for close to 20 years now, and every 5 years he gets a new $500 million contract. So this format is digital, not analog, very similar to the change from vinyl to CD. And again, they're just devoted channels for everything. So a lot of people prefer satellite radio because they get to listen to whatever they want to. So with those changes in mind, Napster leading to iTunes, social media, specifically MySpace, later Facebook and YouTube, and satellite radio. Now let's jump into the music of the 2000s. So let's start with hip hop. By the year 2000, hip hop is 25 years old. Hip hop culture is everywhere. It's in commercials, clothing, fashion, the Oscars, it's bumper music if you go to sporting events. Snoop Dogg has gone mainstream. He joins Martha Stewart on her cooking show, Martha Stewart Living. Hip hop and rap songs, because of these successes and changes, began to shift away from the street model where you're doing this reality rap, gangster rap, and they start rapping about just how successful they are. And again, we started to see this with the assassinations of Biggie and Tupac anyway, but now it's just moving more toward this model of it's all about partying and look how successful I am. Not every artist, but many artists. One example of this would be Ja Rule's song Living It Up. Most important hip-hop figure in the 2000s arguably is Eminem, whose success continues to skyrocket. He releases the Marshall Mathers LP with the Real Slim Shady. And what's interesting is he's getting almost no radio play. That would have been impossible a few decades ago, but he is getting his music on MTV and another station that plays music videos that has popped up by this point called VH1. But he does it without radio, and he sells amazing numbers of copies. So, following the success of the Real Slim Shady, we also have his first movie called 8 Mile, which is very similar to Purple Rain by Prince, where Prince in Purple Rain wasn't really playing himself, but he's kind of playing himself. Same thing in this one. Eminem's not really playing himself, but he's playing a character who is from Detroit and lives through very similar life experiences that he had to live through as he was trying to become a rapper. Big hit song from that movie is called Lose Yourself. It actually won the Oscar for Best Song for Motion Picture. Now, just like mainstream hip-hop, Eminem starts to have this success, and his lyrics start to change. It's not quite as violent and aggressive as it used to be. It's often writing about his frustrations with his ex-wife Kim, or his mom, or his daughter, whom he loves very much, Haley. You'll hear Haley's name mentioned all the time. We get songs like The Way I Am, Stan, which samples a song from Dido. There was a famous live performance with Elton John, who was openly gay at the time, and everyone thought Eminem's lyrics were so homophobic. Actually, Eminem doesn't have any problem with gay people, and he and Elton John are close friends. It's just sort of this theme of hip-hop culture to use certain homophobic terminology, but on a personal level, Eminem was perfectly fine. He and Elton John, again, are close friends. Songs Without Me, Sing for the Moment, which samples Aerosmith's Dream On. So Aerosmith is one of the most successful rap groups, and they're not a rap group, they're a rock group. but their song, the adaptation of Walk This Way by Run DMC is one of the biggest rock hits, excuse me, one of the biggest rap hits, and Sing for the Moment, adapted from Dream On, is also one of the biggest rap hits. And all Aerosmith had to do was write music that rappers felt was good and usable in sampling in other music. Well, Eminem and Dr. Dre began working together. So up to this point, Eminem was a protege of Dr. Dre. Dr. Dre was his mentor, but now they're collaborating with a new artist named 50 Cent. 50 Cent releases this song called In the Club. And this is, if you watch the music video, they're in a laboratory and they're trying to build the perfect rapper and write the perfect club banger. And really, they achieve it. It goes on to be a huge success. And there's actually this theory that one of the songs that most epitomizes your youth experience and one of your favorite songs supposedly will be the song that was #1 on the charts the day you turned 14 years old. And just something about that age group, like 14 to 16, is really when a lot of people's musical tastes sort of become solidified for the rest of their life. Well, my birthday, the year I turned 14, was March 3rd, 2003, and In the Club was the #1 hit song that week. So apparently In the Club is my song that is representative of me as a musician and music listener. Who knew? Eminem also joins a rap group, kind of like Run DMC or Public Enemy or NWA, where it's a group of rappers singing together, Sugar Hill Gang for that matter. This is called D12, and you can check out one of their songs called My Band. Jay-Z, who I mentioned earlier, was a famous rapper in the 1990s, singing about these street rap themes growing up in New York, but now he has money and now he has success. And what's interesting about Jay-Z, tracking the change in his music, is we get to follow that success and see how does this artist respond to these lifestyle changes. It's watching a rapper grow up, and it's really one of the first great examples where we had an opportunity to do that. Well, he releases one of the biggest rap albums of all time in 2003. It's called The Black Album. The Black Album was produced by Rick Rubin of Def Jam. So again, Def Jam was responsible for so much of the 80s rap that was able to combine rock and rap together. Beastie Boys, Run DMC. Def Jam also produced Public Enemy's early work. And again, it's this AC/DC style electric guitar with these hip-hop breakbeats. That's Rick Rubin's specialty. And Rick Rubin, his mastery of the genre is on full display in the Black Album. 99 Problems is probably one of the biggest hits off of that album. And this proves to the hip-hop community that artists can have longevity. Because unfortunately, a lot of hip-hop up to this point has either been one-hit wonders or people who've been assassinated. Now, there are many, speaking today, there are many hip-hop artists who have extraordinary longevity, but at this point, Jay-Z was one of the earliest examples of that longevity. In 2008, Jay-Z marries Beyonce Knowles, now Beyonce Knowles Carter. We also see a technique called auto-tune coming into prevalence. And that can be best heard on a song called Low, which is actually by someone named Flo Rida, but featuring T-Pain. T-Pain is the artist people associate with autotune. It's when you can go back in after someone records something and kind of doctor the notes they sing to make it sound like they're singing the right pitches even if they're not. And it's a way to make up for people that can't sing on key. Well, what T-Pain does is he uses it not to correct his singing, but as a vocal effect. Listen to any T-Pain song and you'll hear it right away. But again, Low is the example I've included on here for you. Well, at this point, hip-hop has always been about New York, California, but what's going on in other parts of the country? So let's look at hip-hop in the South. We see the group Outkast. So Outkast is a duo group with Andre 3000 and Big Boi. They had an early hit called The Whole World, but their big hit was called Hey Ya, with a famous music video to go along with it. It almost doesn't even sound like hip-hop. It sounds like 1960s Motown. And in the video, it depicts Beatlemania-style girls screaming over Outkast. Again, amazing music video, was on the video charts for a very long time. And with this song, we get this expression, shake it like a Polaroid picture. So Polaroid pictures or Polaroid cameras were cameras that actually came out in the 70s, but were famous for a long time. And the way it would work is a big camera, and you take a picture, and immediately the photograph would come out, and there was a chemical reaction that would take place. And it took a few minutes, and for whatever reason, people thought it was activated by air or something. So they would like shake it, thinking that that would make the picture develop faster. it didn't, but everyone seemed to think it did. So shake it like a Polaroid picture was referring to dance moves. Shake that like you would a Polaroid picture. Let's move on to country music. So country music in the 2000s. We can't talk about country music in the 2000s and understand what's going on if we don't talk about the terrorist attacks in 2001. So on September 11th, 2001, America is attacked by Al Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. 2,977 civilians died. They hijacked 4 commercial jetliners. They flew one into each of the 2 World Trade Center towers in New York City. They flew one into the Pentagon, and the 4th one was headed toward the White House. But the passengers on the flight were able to overpower their attackers, and the plane crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. This was the worst attack by a foreign enemy on American soil in our history in terms of casualties. And we see this surge in patriotism, and country music is really the main voice of that patriotism. So the most important figure in this would be Toby Keith, who's leading the charge, and one of the most indicative songs is called Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue. He originally wanted to call it The Angry American, but his record label wouldn't let him, so he just calls it Courtesy of the Red, White, and Blue. But on some live performances, he still calls it The Angry American, which is interesting. He has this line in it: "You'll be sorry that you messed with the US of A, because we'll put a boot in your ass, it's the American way," and people just went crazy. However, there's another lyric from that song that was somewhat problematic. The actual lyric is, "A mighty sucker punch came flying in from somewhere in the back, but a lot of people would sing a mighty sucker punch came flying in from somewhere in Iraq." And the problem was Iraq didn't attack us. It was Al Qaeda, who was based in Afghanistan and funded by Saudi Arabia, but it had nothing to do with Iraq. And by people changing those lyrics, it just further spread this idea that Iraq was somehow involved when they weren't. Country music had dipped in the mainstream in recent years, but this trend brings it back to the forefront of American music, at least for a few years. And again, it's not quite on the scale of Garth Brooks, who by this point was retired, but it's still significant. We also see country singers such as Aaron Tippin with his song Where the Stars and Stripes and the Eagle Fly, with lyrics such as "I pledge allegiance to this flag. If that bothers you, then that's too bad." Daryl Worley with Have You Forgotten? But it's not only this hyper patriotic music. We also just see some sort of like new traditionalists emerging in country. For example, Brad Paisley is this virtuosic guitar player, can play any style, and he has songs that are just about traditional country themes. One of the greatest early examples would be Mud on the Tires. Now, what's interesting is in music, there is no opposition to this message when it's only about responding to the terrorist attacks on 9/11. Again, almost 3,000 people were killed. But when this war on terror begins, when America starts first invading Afghanistan, but then invades Iraq, even though Iraq wasn't tied at all to the events that happened, all of a sudden we see this partisan shift where half the country, who initially were united, George Bush, following the September 11th attacks, has the highest public approval rating of any president in history. However, it very quickly shifts because half the country, we start to see racism build, we start to see lives lost in the war, we start to see our budget, which, we removed the national deficit for the first time in decades. That quickly changes, we go deeply into debt. The other half are still angry and they want to do anything we can to make sure that there's not a future terrorist attack. So they're looking at an invasion of Iraq as preventative measures because many suspected that they had weapons of mass destruction. Now, they didn't actually have them, but many people thought they might have, so it made sense to go in there and invade Iraq. However, again, we see this big shift, a shift that I would argue hasn't really gone away. Now, it's even in country. So we have this group called the Dixie Chicks, who we talked about a little bit last week, and their lead singer, whose name is Natalie Maines, she says at a concert, "We're ashamed that the President of the United States is from Texas." They're also from Texas. Protesters are outraged. You see footage on the news of tractors and people's feet stomping on and crushing Dixie Chicks records. Same thing we saw with the Beatles and with NWA at different points. One woman on the news is trying to get her toddler to say "screw 'em" about the Dixie Chicks. Pat Buchanan, political commentator, calls them the Dixie Twits on national television. Bill O'Reilly, another political commentator, calls them callow, foolish women who deserve to be slapped around. And for the radio stations, a lot of people are saying, we're boycotting them and you're going to boycott them too, or we're going to stop listening to your stations if you keep playing this music. And the radio stations overnight turn their backs on the Dixie Chicks, so we're just not hearing any of their music for quite a while. Numerous death threats, the three members of the band, but especially Natalie Maines. And looking back, scholars have now said that the Dixie Chicks, in their willingness to be critical of the president in that way, say that they're more daring than any punk band was, and they're a country group of three women. Well, 3 years later, they returned to the venue where where Natalie Maines originally made that statement, and they say it again. They say, just in case there's any confusion, we're still ashamed that the President of the United States is from Texas, and this time they received thunderous applause because their fans shifted. Half of them really rejected them. At the same time, in the 3 years since then, more and more of the public have turned against the war on terror. So they have more support now. But Natalie Maines and the Dixie Chicks released this song called Not Ready to Make Nice, where she talks about how angry she is, how the fans turn their backs, and the death threat. But the problem with that is, for decades, we as a society have asked artists to be barometers of culture and voices of dissent. And this is significantly less intense, critical, and violent than what punk and rock bands had been saying in the 60s and 70s. It's just that they said it at this time where, again, hyper-patriotism, you weren't supposed to say anything critical, and they did. They broke that unwritten rule, and they were country artists, and they were women, and for all these reasons, people turned their backs on them, but they have since become famous again as they've recovered from that scandal. We have to talk about Garth Brooks, who's still retired. Again, his kids are in high school, his kids are in school, but he begins releasing unreleased music. So it's music that he recorded years ago, just never made it onto a CD. He starts releasing that music. So you can still buy new Garth Brooks music, but it's older music that you're hearing for the first time. He releases this music in an exclusive deal with Walmart. What's really interesting is he refuses to work with iTunes. He thinks that iTunes is getting a monopoly on the music industry and that that's not fair to other music publishers. And he says he's only going to sell hard copies. He's not going to sell digital copies. And he's not the only band to do that. AC/DC does that. A lot of bands do that at first, although he was the last one to hold out. Very recently, Garth Brooks allowed his music to be released on Amazon, but he still won't use his music. He still won't release his music on iTunes or Spotify. Well, that's what's going on with country. Let's talk about some of these reactions. So again, a lot of people are feeling overwhelmed by this. First the patriotism, then the anger. Well, the music industry softens, and a lot of people, rather than commenting on it, they just want escapism. They want to not think about all this stuff that's going on. So we start to see groups like the singer Norah Jones, who is the daughter of Ravi Shankar, who worked with the Beatles in India. Her song I Don't Know Why, or Don't Know Why. Jack Johnson with Bubble Toes. Coldplay with their song Yellow, which is really appealing to these 90s alt kids. People who grew up with Nirvana as young teenagers are now in their early 20s, and they love this stuff. At least many of them do. John Mayer, songs like No Such Thing and Your Body is a Wonderland. John Mayer is this virtuosic guitar player who writes these sentimental love songs. But that's sort of like pop music still. Let's talk about rock in the 2000s. We have Blink-182 from San Diego, California. This is another pop-punk band. They had hits in the late 90s like Damn It off of Dude Ranch and All the Small Things off of Enema of the State. All the Small Things came out in 1999, but it was still on the charts and very successful into 2000, 2001. There's this line, "Work sucks, I know." Kids would just go crazy screaming that line at school dances, things like that. In the music video, they are mocking boy bands. So they're mocking NSYNC and Backstreet Boys, things like that. They also have another hit come out a few years later, 2003, called I Miss You, and this is a big change in them. It's getting away from this sort of immature rock to a slightly more mature sort of love song type. We have Linkin Park from Los Angeles, California, who are kind of a rock hip-hop crossover. They have a lead singer and sort of a lead rapper, and the two of them alternate. They also have hip-hop drums with electric guitar, almost kind of like what Def Jam was doing, but independent of Def Jam, and it's West Coast. Off of their first album, we get songs like Crawling in the End. Off their follow-up, we get songs like Numb and Somewhere I Belong. We have Sum 41 from Ontario, Canada, another pop punk band with their hits like Still Waiting. The White Stripes, one of the biggest rock bands of the early 2000s. Seven Nation Army is still one of the most popular rock songs. If you go into Guitar Center, you're probably going to hear someone playing Seven Nation Army. System of a Down, a lot of big hits from them. Chop Suey, Aerials, and Toxicity. Now at this point, let's talk about Van Halen. So again, Van Halen came on the scene in the late 70s, one of the biggest bands in the 1980s with lead guitar player Eddie Van Halen, lead singer David Lee Roth. David Lee Roth left the group. They replaced him with Sammy Hagar. They started producing more synth-based music with Sammy Hagar, more love songs, stayed with him through the 80s and the 90s. They briefly did an album with another singer called Gary Cherone of the band Extreme with hits like More Than Words. Then they got back with Sammy. In the early 2000s, 2004, I saw Van Halen perform twice on one tour. I saw him with Sammy Hagar, once in Los Angeles, once in San Francisco. Great show. I prefer David Lee Roth, but they had a lot of great hits with Sammy. Then in 2007, they finally reunite with David Lee Roth once again. The problem with Sammy Hagar is they weren't playing much of their early music, and that was some of their best music. They were kind of only doing the Sammy stuff. Well, finally, fans, for the first time in, what would it be, 20 years, get to hear the music of David Lee Roth live again, all the music with the original singer. I got the chance to see him perform in Madison Square Garden in New York City. It was an amazing show. And they also released a new album called A Different Kind of Truth. Now, half the songs on this album were old songs that they had written in the 70s. They just never released, so they re-recorded those songs in 2000 and in the late 2000s. And the other half of the songs they had just written new. One of the main singles they released off of that album were called Tattoo. And David Lee Roth, even though he's in his 60s now, continues to get tattoos, and he has just a full body coverage. There's like a strip, it's like his face, his neck, and a strip of his chest don't have tattoos. Every other part of his body is covered in tattoos. We have bands like My Chemical Romance with their songs I'm Not Okay, I Promise, and My Chemical Romance is a good example of these scene kids, and scene kind of coincided with MySpace's rise, so this is an example of what scene looks like. This is what I went through high school seeing all around me. They also have another song called Welcome to the Black Parade. We have bands like the Arctic Monkeys with I Bet You Look Good on the Dance Floor, Vampire Weekend with their songs A-Punk, The Killers, Mr. Brightside, Nickelback, who is the butt of many jokes now, but was really actually very big in the 2000s, songs like How You Remind Me and Photograph. And with many of these bands I've listed, rock has become numb and apolitical, and it doesn't have that will to fight that we heard in the bands of the late 60s from San Francisco with the protest music, or of the 70s with like the Sex Pistols or these other bands pressing boundaries like Kiss or heavy metal with how aggressive it was. Finally, it went from this outward aggression to this inward reflection with grunge, and now finally we're at the point where it's turned into just this kind of shadow of what rock used to be. Still great music, but it lacks the edge and aggression it used to have. Then in 2004, that all turns around when Green Day releases their album American Idiot. Now, I will make the argument that American Idiot is the last great rock and roll album. So this song has a ton of hits, opening with American Idiot, Jesus of Suburbia, Holiday, Boulevard of Broken Dreams, Wake Me Up When September Ends. Not only was American Idiot a hit album, and not only did it revitalize a career for Green Day, but it was also the definitive statement on the Bush administration. So American Idiot is not a reaction to 9/11, like all those country songs were. American Idiot is a reaction to the reactions of 9/11. So it's fighting back. It's this hard-hitting sound that's carrying on the traditions of rock. It's a concept album. You have to listen to it in order. You have to listen to the whole thing in order. There are characters. If you read through the album liner, you can kind of get an idea of what's going on. You can still tell from just listening, but you get more of an idea if you read the album liner. Because of the success of this album, Green Day launches a massive 2-year world tour. And 5 years later, American Idiot, which was always envisioned as a story, actually opens on Broadway as a Broadway musical featuring the music of American Idiot. So you've already listened to it and got the story. Now you get to see actors portray the story. And one of the characters, called St. Jimmy, is actually not with the original cast, but into the production of American Idiot, Billy Joe Armstrong, lead singer from Green Day, actually started to play the role of St. Jimmy on Broadway. As we get to the latter half of the decade, we also see the band, very similar to No Doubt, a female singer, Hayley Williams, with an all-male band behind her called Paramore, with hits like Misery Business. The band called The Strokes, with their song Last Night. And what's interesting is a lot of people thought The Strokes were going to be the next big act in rock music. Didn't quite pan out that way, but at the time, people really were excited about their music. Noel Gallagher of Oasis claimed that right away they were the most important band in the world. Remember, he had no sense of humility. He was very egotistical and saying that Oasis was the best band in the country. Well, then he said that the Strokes were the best band in the world. So very high praise. And then the last rock band we'll talk about is called the Yeah Yeah Yeahs, another female-driven band with a lead singer who's a female with an all-male band, and their song Maps. In the 2000s, the producer strikes back. Once again, it's the rise of the producer. This is pendulum where it goes back and forth between the artists and the producer, and the artist and the producer. Well, we definitely see the rise of the producer once again. Two of the producers I'd like to draw your attention to are, number one is Timbaland, worked with Jay-Z with Dirt Off Your Shoulder, bringing in these ideas of Afrofuturism we've talked about multiple times now. Missy Elliott with Work It, Justin Timberlake, Sexy Back, and One Republic with Apologize. We have Pharrell working with Snoop Dogg with hits like Drop It Like It's Hot. So Snoop Dogg also was able to come out of the the fall of Death Row and have success. Songs with Nelly like Hot in Here, 2 R's, Hot in Her. Gwen Stefani, Hollaback Girl. And again, this is something where if you want to be a pop star in the 2000s, and even more so in the 2010s, you need a hip-hop producer to give you hip-hop cred. So this is something that we'll see more and more of. And in fact, we see it so much that many hip-hop producers begin just working in pop music in general. They kind of abandon hip-hop. They make the same music, but not with people who are traditionally hip-hop artists, but people who are just pop artists. One of the most important figures for producers would be Kanye West. So yes, people think of Kanye West as a solo artist today, but he was actually originally a producer working with Jay-Z, Alicia Keys, Ludacris, Janet Jackson. But the difference was wanted to be a star. You can maybe think about a tie to Puff Daddy, right? Puff Daddy was one of the producers for Bad Boy Entertainment. After Biggie's death, Puff Daddy emerged as a star. We could assume that that's kind of something he wanted all along anyway, putting himself in music videos and things like that. Well, Kanye West was very open about wanting that. First big album is called College Dropout. Check out the song Through the Wire. Before recording this album, Kanye West was in a car accident, and in the hospital, his jaw was wired shut, and he's actually rapping on the album in the hospital with a jaw that he can barely move. Sounds very distinct because his mouth is basically wired shut, and he's just rapping about how badly he wants to be a rapper. And then in 2007, he really hits mainstream success with his song Stronger, which samples Daft Punk. Again, it's all about sampling. Ever since Puff Daddy had success with sampling The Police, Every Breath You Take, with I'll Be Missing You, all these hip-hop artists are going to be doing sampling. Follows up the next year with a hit Heartless. People have described Kanye West as indulging his narcissistic fantasies through the medium of music. He is quoted as saying, and this is a video online, you can go watch it, "My greatest pain in life is that I'll never be able to see me perform. So you are welcome to a pleasure that I will never have." If we think about Kanye West, though, he's really a rock star. He is doing what Led Zeppelin and all these groups, the hair metal bands of the 80s, he's doing what they were doing. He's acting in that narcissistic way, but he's a hip-hop artist doing it. At the same time, while he's so egotistical, he also allows himself to be vulnerable and sing very honest, open lyrics. Maybe that's similar to a power ballad. You could make an argument there with parallels to heavy metal to Kanye West. In 2009, at the Music Video Awards, Taylor Swift wins an award for Best Music Video. And I'm just going to let you watch and see what happens.
Yo, Taylor, I'm really happy for you. I'm going to let you finish. But Beyonce had one of the best videos of all time. One of the best videos of all time.
Kanye West, ladies and gentlemen. Other artists try to bare their souls in music like Kanye did. Artists such as Drake with Best I Ever Had, and Usher with Confessions, Part 2. Now, while we had some big superstars in R&B in the 2000s, the biggest superstars in the 2000s were the women. Alicia Keys is an amazing songwriter, singer, and pianist. Hits such as Fallen, No One, and she sings on the Jay-Z song Empire State of Mind. Beyonce is continuing in her mainstream success. The song Single Ladies and the music video that went along with it are a smash hit. She's also in films like Austin Powers Goldmember, Dreamgirls, and Obsessed. We have Rihanna, and I actually was doing some research recently on how to say her name, because everyone says Rihanna, but every once in a while someone says Rihanna. So I said, I'm just going to look up how she introduces herself, and she says Rihanna with a kind of a hard A there. So if you didn't know, now you do. Rihanna, who has this kind of Caribbean feel and accent, and one of her biggest songs from the decade was called Umbrella, featuring Jay-Z. So we have a question that we have to talk about, which is, how do you make money as an artist in this iTunes world? If you're only getting, again, less than 10% what you would have made a decade earlier, how do you make money? Well, there are a few ways. Both the biggest bands in the world and indie bands are all licensing their music for use in commercials. Again, in the past, that would have been considered selling out, but now it's just, you have to make money somehow. iPod commercials in particular, many songs that are hits sort of became hits because they were featured in iPod commercials. Concert ticket prices explode. If these artists aren't making their money from record sales like they used to, they're going to make that money somewhere else, and it's going to be in concert ticket sales. If you would have seen a concert, like for example, I saw band Boston in 2003 was my first concert, and the tickets weren't that bad. I saw them at the Mandalay Bay in Las Vegas, and it was like $30, which was, not bad at all. Then, 4 years later, I saw Van Halen at Madison Square Garden, and I paid $160 for one ticket, and it wasn't even on the floor. It was way in the back. $160 a ticket. So that's what these bands do. Now, a lot of people actually make this argument that what they call music piracy, stealing music, file sharing, whatever you want to call it, it's not really that bad, because the difference is that these multimillionaires only make 17 million instead of 21 million. So they're still so well off that they're taking advantage of people by charging these exorbitant amounts of money for their concert tickets or records. And I'm not saying I agree with that, but I understand the feeling there. But there's a very interesting documentary that came out with Rob Cavallo, who works with Green Day, who works with My Chemical Romance. And what he explained is the artists are still making their money. The people on top are still making that money. The people who suffer, unfortunately, are the little guys. Like janitors don't get paid as much, and secretaries don't get paid as much. That it's sort of a trickle-down effect, right? The people on top still get what they need to make, and it's everyone else who suffers. So I'm certainly an advocate for acquiring music legally. Well, we're getting near the end here, so how does the decade end? Well, the decade opened with boy bands, and it closes with solo women. We have Lady Gaga coming onto the scene with big hits like Poker Face and Bad Romance, and she's challenging this perception of women in the music industry, very similar to, well, not similar to Madonna, but she's doing something similar to what Madonna was doing, but in a very different way. So Madonna was just hypersexualizing everything to say that it's okay for women to do this, whereas Lady Gaga was forced to be sexual in her videos. She was forced to wear skimpy clothing, and she was forced to do all these dance moves. So her way of responding to that was just to write absolutely ridiculous lyrics. Like the song Poker Face or Bad Romance or Love Game have almost nonsensical lyrics, and that was her way of reacting to that. That if you're going to force me to make this kind of music, I'm just going to make it absolutely ridiculous. But what's interesting is people loved it anyway. They didn't really mind that the lyrics were kind of silly, because it's all about dancing and having a good time anyway. She makes some serious artistic statements as well. For example, she showed up to award shows wearing dresses made of meat, or with her face completely covered, every ounce of her body covered, and people just have to say, I'm sorry, who are you? And she has to say, I'm Lady Gaga. Nicki Minaj, rising out of hip-hop but going mainstream with songs like Super Bass. Taylor Swift, songwriter, another artist who was initially famous from MySpace. Absolutely amazing success for how young she is at the time. So she would have been, let's see, 2009, she would have been 20, with big hits like You Belong With Me and Love Story that she wrote. Initially, Taylor Swift is country, but she's very quickly going to transition into pop. The music industry becomes do-it-yourself. Between DAWs, digital audio workstations, so computer setups at home where you can record your own music, and programs like Logic and Pro Tools that allow you to record your music, it allows musicians to record professional quality records at home, and then platforms like iTunes, MySpace, and later YouTube allow musicians to take their music directly to the fans, to post it in a way where the fans can access it. In many respects, this is like the great equalizer. It's not about who the music industry decides will be a hit. It's not about who the people at MTV want to put in a rotation. Again, Nirvana really was famous because someone at MTV decided that they would be, because they put their music on. Now, you put your music on YouTube, and whatever's successful, that's what's going to win. We begin to chart the success of music through YouTube, Spotify, Apple Music, and SoundCloud plays more than album sales. Enormous companies, record companies, are going out of business because the music industry changed so drastically in less than 10 years. One of the best examples from the 2010s of this new model, of someone finding success with this new model, would be Justin Bieber. So Justin Bieber's song, Baby, featuring Ludacris, again, you have to have that hip-hop cred, you have to have the rap solo in the middle. Justin Bieber was famous from YouTube. He put his music up on YouTube, and he just gained this traction following organically, and that led to mainstream success without a record label from the beginning, like artists would have had to do up until this point. We also have the question of, okay, well, music is changing, and how do you put this diverse group of music and musicians on stage? Well, people are discovering music individually in their rooms going online, but there's still this sense of wanting to share music with each other. So that evolves into Coachella in Indio, California, which is an outdoor music festival. And what's interesting is even though it's a lot of bands playing, bands many of whom became famous through the internet and social media, we also see this rise in the DJ tent getting bigger and bigger. At first, it was all about the bands, and the bands are still important, the singers are still important, but the DJ is becoming even more important with each passing year. By this point, the hip-hop artists are rock stars. The DJs are rock stars. Who isn't a rock star? The rock stars. Again, I made this argument that American Idiot was the last big, world-famous, great rock album, because as we move into this final decade, we're not going to see rock on the level that it once was. Well, that concludes the main content for this unit, but I do want to wrap up by talking about 3 figures who have been important through our story that I think we need to address at this point. In the early 2000s, Phil Spector, famous for The Wall of Sound and for working with the Beach Boys and for working with the Beatles, is in prison for murder. Yes, he's in prison for murder, and he's still in prison today. Michael Jackson, you may have noticed I haven't commented on it up to this point, but he seems to have changed races. Michael Jackson is African American, but by the time we get to the music of the 2000s, he appears to be white. Michael Jackson has a skin disease called vitiligo. It's not very common, but you've probably met people with this before. It's when their skin starts to change colors and you see a loss of pigment on some portions of their skin. And it can result in having certain sections of your skin becoming very light while other sections are dark. And again, if you're a person with a darker skin tone, it's more obvious than someone with a lighter skin tone. Well, Michael Jackson's response to that, in action with that, was rather than having certain parts of his skin which are lighter colors than others, he just lightens all of his skin. After years of not performing, Michael Jackson announces a series of performances in London, England. And he starts rehearsing for these. It's going to be called This Is It concert series. However, on June 25th, 2009, Michael Jackson dies at 50 years old of cardiac arrest. Now, it's actually declared involuntary manslaughter. They're saying that Dr. Conrad Murray was responsible for his death, that it was a homicide, but it was an unintentional homicide. Dr. Murray was administering drugs to Michael Jackson, and he gave him too much, and basically Michael Jackson had an overdose, which led to a heart attack. And as a doctor, Conrad Murray should have known that that was dangerous. It was determined by a group of medical experts. That's something that he should have known about and he should have done, but he didn't. It was negligence, resulted in involuntary manslaughter. George Harrison of the Beatles also passes away in 2001, November 29th, 2001, after losing a battle with cancer. So at this point, there are only two Beatles remaining, Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. Well, let's take a look at the summary for the 2000s. Think about how far we've come with the limits that the 1950s indie labels faced and how it was so difficult for them to get their music out there and get it heard by people. And now we can record a song in an afternoon, put it on the internet, everyone in the world could theoretically hear that song if they wanted to. We previously had these divisions in music, especially on the radio and the record industry, between AM and FM, with pop or rock, and then black or white divisions within the music industry and among fans. But that's all ended by the 2000s. Really, most people are listening to most genres of music. It's not at all unlikely for someone to be a fan of hip hop and rock and country. In 1997, Apple faced bankruptcy. By 2010, Apple was the most valuable technology company in the world, largely because of the music industry with iTunes and the iPod. The computer, by this point, has displaced the guitar as the primary instrument in popular music. The next Elvis, Beatles, Eddie Van Halen, Michael Jackson, or Garth Brooks, whoever this next big figure in popular music is, will likely not be playing a guitar. This person will be making their music with a computer, and we're going to have to see where that trend takes us next time in the 2010s.